You've seen his face 100 times, even if you never learned his name. He's the man who made you laugh in Friday. The steady hand beside Jamie Foxx in Ray. The menace in Menace to Society. For more than 3 decades, Clifton Powell has been one of Hollywood's most dependable character actors. The guy directors called when a scene needed weight, humor, or quiet danger. Sometimes, all in the same breath. But behind the steady stream of film credits sits a legal saga that stretched across the better part of a decade. One involving a serious accusation, a courtroom mistake, a stunning reversal, and a career that never fully escaped the noise. This is not a story about a final sentence. Powell was never convicted of any crime. It's a story about how slow, complicated, and unresolved the American legal system can be, and how that uncertainty can follow a public figure for years, whether or not the facts ever get fully sorted out. Long before the lawsuits, there was a kid from Southeast Washington, D.C., growing up in a neighborhood where survival itself could be a full-time job. Powell's mother died when he was only 4 years old. His father struggled with alcoholism. The stability most children take for granted simply wasn't there. What kept him from being swallowed by the streets, he said, was a small circle of mentors and family who refused to let him disappear into the same fate as so many of his childhood friends. He found his way to acting, and by 1993 he'd landed a role in Menace to Society, a film that didn't just launch his career, it announced him as an actor who could bring raw, lived-in authenticity to the screen. From there, the work never stopped. The Friday franchise turned him into a fan favorite for his comic timing. Ray earned him an NAACP Image Award nomination for his portrayal of Jeff Brown, Ray Charles's road manager, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jamie Foxx's Oscar-winning performance. Rush Hour, Dead Presidents, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? Next Friday. The credits piled up until they numbered over 100. What made Powell valuable wasn't just volume. It was range. He could terrify an audience with a look and disarm them with a joke 2 scenes later. Directors trusted him because he could be handed almost anything and make it land. In August 2011, Powell's life took a turn that would define the next decade in ways his film Resume never could. A woman who would later sue under the pseudonym Kiani Myers, at the time a cocktail waitress at a New Orleans casino, where she and Powell had crossed paths before, alleged that an encounter with Powell in a hotel room began consensually and then turned violent when she asked him to stop. Powell has maintained throughout that the encounter was fully consensual. Myers reported the incident to police. According to the lead detective who investigated, inconsistencies emerged in her account, and the case was closed without criminal charges. The detective would later state in a sworn affidavit that when she was asked directly whether she'd been forced, Myers said no. No arrest. No criminal conviction. Ever. But that wasn't the end of it. A year later, in August 2012, Myers filed a civil lawsuit in federal court, seeking damages for assault, battery, and emotional distress. And it's here that the story takes its most dramatic and least Hollywood turn. Civil court doesn't work like criminal court. There's no jury of the public, no verdict announced on the courthouse steps. It runs on paperwork, deadlines, and procedure. And in 2013, procedure very nearly buried Clifton Powell. He didn't respond to the lawsuit, not because he was hiding from it, he'd later argue, but because he says he was never properly served with the legal papers in the first place, that he only learned a federal lawsuit existed when a reporter told him, more than a year after the police had already closed their investigation. Under federal rules, a defendant who doesn't answer a complaint can have a default judgment entered against him. The court essentially accepts the plaintiff's version of events as true because no one showed up to contest it. That's exactly what happened. In 2013, a judge entered a default judgment against Powell, later awarding Myers roughly $150,000 in damages. For 3 years, that judgment stood. An actor who had never been criminally charged, who had denied the allegations from the start, was legally on the hook for a 6-figure judgment he says he didn't even know existed until it was already entered. It's hard to imagine a more surreal position. Acquitted in the court of criminal law, condemned by default in the court of civil law, and blindsided by both. In 2016, with new counsel, Powell finally fought back, not on the underlying allegations, but on the process itself. He argued he'd been failed twice. First by an attorney who, he says, effectively abandoned his defense, and second by a service of process that never actually reached him. In January 2017, a federal judge agreed. The default judgment was vacated. The case Powell didn't know he'd already lost was suddenly, legally, back in play. It was a rare kind of vindication, not a declaration of innocence, because the underlying claim was never actually tried, but an acknowledgement that Powell had been condemned without ever getting the chance to defend himself. The court reopened the case for further proceedings. And in a twist that captures just how tangled this saga became, when Powell tried to countersue Myers for defamation and emotional distress, a judge dismissed those claims too in January 2018, not because they lacked merit, but because Louisiana law gives plaintiffs only 1 year to file defamation claims, and Powell's came years too late. So the record, as it stands in the public court file, no criminal charges were ever filed. A civil default judgment was entered, then vacated for improper service. Powell's own counterclaims were dismissed as untimely. What isn't fully settled in the document available is exactly how, or whether, the underlying civil claim was ultimately resolved after the case reopened. What is clear is that a legal question that began in a New Orleans hotel room in 2011 was still generating court filings deep into 2018. Here's the part of Powell's story that has nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with how Hollywood works. Long before any judge ruled on anything, the headlines had already done their damage. TMZ ran the story within days of the lawsuit's filing. Tabloid outlets reported the raw allegations in blunt terms that left little room for nuance. And in an industry that runs on image and risk aversion, that kind of coverage doesn't wait for due process. Powell has spoken about work that dried up during those years, roles that vanished, opportunities that quietly stopped coming. Whether that was a direct response to the lawsuit or simply the ordinary unpredictability of an acting career is something only the people making those casting decisions could really say. But Powell has been candid that the period took a personal toll that outlasted any single court filing, describing it, in interviews, as one of the hardest stretches of his life. That's really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire saga. A civil lawsuit is not a criminal conviction. A default judgment entered because of a service of process failure is not a finding of guilt. It's actually the opposite of a finding, since no evidence was ever weighed. And yet none of that nuance travels as fast or as far as an initial headline. Powell was never convicted of anything. But reputational damage doesn't require a conviction. Sometimes it just requires an allegation, a lawsuit, and a news cycle that moves faster than the legal system it's covering. What's remarkable, looking at the full arc of Powell's life, is how much he built anyway. A childhood shaped by loss and instability. A marriage that ultimately ended, with Powell open about the financial and emotional cost of the divorce. Candid admissions about gambling, about being away from his children more than he wishes he had been, about the temptations that come with fame. And running underneath all of it, a decade-long legal entanglement that began with an accusation, detoured through a legal error that nearly cost him 6 figures and his reputation by default, and dragged through federal court for the better part of 10 years. Through all of it, more than 100 film and television credits, an NAACP Image Award nomination, a reputation among directors and casting agents as one of the most versatile character actors of his generation. Powell has also spoken publicly about the extra weight colorism has placed on darker-skinned black actors in Hollywood casting, being told, in his words, that his skin tone made him too dark for certain roles, even as he was celebrated for his intensity in others. None of that erases the legal record, and none of it should. But it does complicate any story that tries to reduce Clifton Powell to a single headline, scandal, sentence, final or otherwise. The public record shows a man who was never criminally charged, who fought a procedural error that could have quietly cost him a great deal, and who kept working through a decade most people would have found unbearable. The real story here isn't a final sentence. It's a reminder of how much can go wrong in the space between an accusation and a verdict, and how long a person can be left standing in that space, waiting for the record to catch up with the truth.